Hi, and welcome to Alive with Chronic Illness, a podcast dedicated to exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness. Today, I'm joined by Ellie Howe, founder of A Note of Hope, to talk about her health journey and how she was inspired to create a platform sharing others' experiences. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ellie. I thought we'd just get started with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to share my story with all of your listeners. So a little bit about me is, hi, I'm Ellie. I am 25, but I first became unwell when I was 16. It seemed to happen quite slowly for me. One minute I was pretty normal, and then I began having upset stomachs and feeling generally quite sick after I was eating and a bit of pain. And eventually that kind of snowballed into not being able to hold down any food, being doubled up in agony for hours after even the tiniest bite of food, and just so much more, really. And it kind of uprooted my whole life, as chronic illness seems to do for everybody. So I was in sick form at the time. I was told that I couldn't stay anymore. So I was sent home. And I was going backwards and forwards through GPs and the hospital. But unfortunately, when you're a 16-year-old girl and you present with stomach issues, nobody believed me. No, everybody thought I was anxious or it was all in my head. And, it took me a really long time to get through the system, to get to see somebody who was like, you know what, I know what's wrong with you and I really want to help you. So that took about 2 years for me to get to that point. But obviously by that point, with the symptoms I was having of vomiting and diarrhea and nausea and all those lovely things, I had lost a lot of weight. So not only was I dealing with those symptoms, I was malnourished, malnourished to the point where basically I was a skeleton, but also it meant that my hair was falling out. I struggled to walk, so I was reliant on a wheelchair. I couldn't even go in the bath or shower by myself. I had to have somebody help me to do that. So although, just 2 years of that to get to that point, obviously I look back now and I think, God, I wish somebody would have done something earlier or stepped in earlier so that it hadn't got to that critical point before they thought, okay, we need to step in and do something. But luckily, even though all my test results came back normal, the consultant I was at under my local hospital said that, I don't feel right discharging you. He had done everything he felt that he could do. He said that. I don't feel right discharging you, he said, based on how much weight you have lost and what you're still saying to me. So I will refer you to this specialist hospital in London, but I don't think they're going to find anything. And I really think this is psychological, but just for peace of mind, we will refer you there. And at that same time, I had seen a completely separate consultant or doctor for a completely different issue because it was affecting every part of me, the malnourishment and stuff. And so I remember she said to me, just as I was in between the phase, she was like, Eleanor, this is ridiculous. You're going to go to this specialist hospital. They're going to tell you that nothing's wrong. And as soon as you come back, we're going to send you to an eating disorder clinic. And I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed because that was pretty much my entire experience up to that point of doctors. And so when I went to the specialist hospital, I really felt I was this is my last chance to be believed. And I really sold myself for about 45 minutes. I was like, everybody says I'm anxious and I'm not anxious. I was quite anxious, but I was trying to prove the point that this was not in my head like it was being suggested. And you know what? Credit to the doctor, because I think I was pretty hysterical, and he let me talk for 45 minutes and he said, it's okay. I don't think this is anxiety. I believe you. And I think I know what's wrong. And the relief of just those words, it meant the world to me, to my family who had watched this happen to me, and really it brought us to breaking point. And from that point, from waiting 2 years for answers, things happened very quickly. So I was immediately brought in for tube feeding. I was diagnosed with gastroparesis, intestinal dysmotility, POTS, hypermobility syndrome. And, you know, when I first went into hospital and I was put on the feeding tube, I was like, this is it. I'm going to gain weight and I'm going to be fixed. I'm going to be better. And really, that was not the case at all. It kept snowballing until the point where I was in a critical condition, again, like very critical. And they said, like, look, the tube feeding isn't working. Your digestive system has completely stopped working. For whatever reason, it's not absorbing any nutrients, and you can't hold down any food or water. So, or even the tube feed, because obviously that's going into your stomach and bowel. And so they told me that I was declared as intestinal failure, and I was put on something called TPN, which is total parenteral nutrition, which is basically the step up from tube feeding, except it's like intravenous. So I have a central line in my chest, which sits right above my heart. It goes into a direct artery, or something more technical than I can explain. And yeah, I absorb my nutrients through that way. And although that fixed the issue of malnutrition and I gained weight, I gained 15 kilograms, which was amazing. And I didn't eat or drink for 2 years, which in itself was a massive challenge. But basically, TPN means you don't need to eat or drink. So that was sorted. One, like, it had saved my life, but I didn't really have a life. You know, I still had uncontrollable symptoms. I was in all the time hospital of them trying different drug trials, and God, I don't even know. I had so many things done and happen to me in such a short space of time. Eventually it got to the point where they were like, look, like, there's nothing more we can do. You're just going to have to accept that this will be your life forever. And as an 18-year-old girl with no prospects or future or really quality of life at all at that point, I was absolutely devastated. I remember sobbing for hours after they told me that. And again, like, very heavy, but I was discharged under palliative care, which is obviously hospice care. And I was in a hospice for my 19th birthday. It was that's a very defining point in my life for obvious reasons. It was a very heavy experience. But again, I really believed that was it, that was going to be my life forever. And if I'm honest with you, I had kind of given up and accepted. I was angry and bitter and resentful, and, you know, I look back at that person, I don't recognize myself because of the way I was behaving, but it was all from just anger at the situation I was in. And really the only reason I'm here today, and as well as I am, we're getting to that, but as well as I am, is because of my mum, of that she never gave up. You know, she is my biggest inspiration of just, you know, when I was at the peak of that, she was still working her 9-to-5 job. She would, before, try and pop in and see me before work, so like between 7 and 9, go for a full day of work, and then come back and stay with me until about 9 o'clock when visiting hours closed, and then go back home to my brother and my dad and my dog and do all the things that a normal mum would do too. So I don't think I realised it at the time, but she, again, like, now I'm like, what a superwoman. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. And you know what? She went through internet forums, Facebook groups, put out pleas for help in some ways. And thankfully, another young woman who was in a similar position to me said, have you ever heard of vascular compressions? I have a couple, and I was diagnosed by the surgeon in London, and he's offered me a surgery that is going to fix me, or he says that can be a cure. And so my mum came into the hospice the next day and said, I booked for you to go and see this surgeon. We're going tonight. She had done it privately, obviously, that's why it was done so quickly. But I think, again, that kind of, it shows our desperation at that time. We were willing to pay or do anything to get me well. And I remember going there, it was in central London, it was a nightmare to get to in rush hour. And I was thinking, this is so awful. Why are you making me do this? Like, they're just going to tell me no again, and I can't cope with that right now. So I went, had some tests done. I sat and waited for the consultant. And when I saw him, he said, we can see some vascular compressions. And I think we can offer you that surgery and it can help you. And you can eat and drink. And he really sold it as like, this is a miracle cure. And we bawled the whole way home. My mum and I bawled the whole way home. But you know what? Just that one bit of hope was all I needed. It reignited, again, like, it gave me something to fight for, but it reignited my hope for the future. And at that time, I had gone back home by that point, and I was having nurses come to the house daily. And I remember the day after that appointment, a nurse came and she stopped at the door of my bedroom and she said, you're smiling, as if it was the weirdest thing in the world. And it was at that point, because I was just miserable all of the time from what I was experiencing and the pain I was in and the vomiting and all of that. And you know what, like, eventually, it took a couple of months, but I went through like all of the pre-op and everything. I had the surgery, and it was a 7-hour surgery. I don't know if I said the vascular compressions I have, which was superior mesenteric artery syndrome, so SMAS, and Nutcracker syndrome. And so for that, I was going to have a Roux-en-Y gastrojejunostomy, very complicated, but basically it's like a gastric bypass. So they were going to cut a bit of my stomach off and attach it to another bit of my bowel, so that rather than relying on the muscles to move food and water and all of the kind of, move food and drink through, it would be more like a drain. So I could eat and drink and it would just go straight through that hole at the bottom of my stomach into the next bit of my bowel, bypassing the compressions which were stopping the movement. And, when I was going in for it, he said, this is a long process. Like, this will be a long recovery. He said, you'll probably hate me for 3 months and then things will get better. And I was like, what is that meant to me? And it's like he has psychic powers or something, because he was bang on with it. The first 3 months were hell. I had sepsis. I needed like several blood transfusions. I was in hospital every day for like 3 months straight. I still couldn't eat or drink anything. I think going into it, when they sold this miracle cure, I had images of waking up from surgery and having a full roast dinner. It wasn't like that. I could only eat and drink by about month 3. And that was like a tiny pot of like pasta, like plain pasta. And that was like, oh my God, I'm holding down pasta, like a spoonful of pasta, and or dipping a biscuit into tea and something. But you know what, like, it was such a long recovery process. And then as soon as I was out of that, COVID hit. So then I was still at home recovering. And you know what, it's been 5 years since that surgery, since my life-changing operation, and I'm living a completely different life. I will still always have health problems. I think from where I've come from, it was an extreme, which means, too much damage was done. So I still deal with very similar symptoms of like sickness and pain and, fatigue, but on a much smaller scale than before. And I still have TPN 1 night a week at the moment, and hoping to reduce that, still going down. And you know what, at the moment I'm studying. I hope to go to uni next year. I've just come back from an amazing holiday in Norway where we saw the Northern Lights and the whales, something I could never have imagined back at that time, So it's really been a journey to get to where I am today, but I'm grateful for every opportunity I have now because of it, and for being as well as I am.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think like that journey that you were on, and then that when you were saying that they were saying it was probably psychological, it really resonated with me. And I think will resonate with a lot of people, and how frustrating it is when you are so unwell and you know how unwell you are, and you're being told, oh, this is something that's psychological. And I can imagine that must have been very scary to face the prospect of, if it doesn't work with this consultant, if they can't find a diagnosis, I could just be diagnosed with having an eating disorder that I do not have.
Yeah, I think that was, again, like, I was terrified of that, and also confused, I think, as well, because when you believe something or you're feeling something, and I sometimes I think like it's because I was so young, but I really reckon that it's probably a universal kind of thing of all ages, really, that I like when you're being told something and you're also going for tests that show that everything is normal, you begin to think, am I crazy? Like, really, am I just imagining all of this, or have I created this in my head? And it was a very psychologically challenging time as well. But also from that environment, I was too frightened to admit that, because I thought if I admitted I was struggling in any way, it would be used against me. So even though I was obviously terrified about, if I was going to die, or what was wrong with me, if it was cancer, I haven't been to school in 2 years, what's my future going to look like? I didn't feel able to say or confide it in anyone, in case it was, oh, well, then that just means it's all in your head, or it's just your anxiety that's causing all of this and stuff. And you know what, through, again, maybe jumping ahead, but through a note of hope and doing something very similar of interviewing and talking to people, that kind of theme of medical gaslighting is so common, terrifyingly common. In nearly every single interview I have done for my blog, it comes up in every interview in some aspect. Sometimes it's more for some people, other times they've just had one experience. But how terribly sad that is the environment that we as patients are going into. I know that even now, sometimes I still go to the doctors and I feel terrified that even if it's something completely normal, that I'm going to be accused of being dramatic, or just facing any kind of unkindness. And how wrong is that, when these people we trust to look after us, and with the most important part of our lives, our health, and we're doubting if we're going to be treated with kindness and empathy. I find that crazy.
Yeah, it is. And when you're in that situation of not being believed, being told that it's in your head, it not only does it kind of invalidate you as an individual, not only is it very scary, but then you lose that ability to have that voice, because you're afraid, well, if I, like you said, if I speak out and I say I'm struggling, it's just going to make them think that it's psychological. So you then lose the right to have those feelings, in a sense, because you can't voice them, or to have them heard, I should say, the right to have those feelings heard. I think that adds multiple layers of complexity. And like you said, medical gaslighting is something that a lot of people I've chatted to through the podcast have brought up. And it's a shared experience that so many people with chronic illness have. And that shouldn't happen. But it seems to be happening well, I don't know if I've met anyone who hasn't experienced it, which is very scary.
I know. I still feel like that too, of just what I guess the most common thing in the UK now is we talk about all the time the state of our NHS and stuff, and obviously they are overstretched and have funding issues, but what happened to just common empathy and kindness? Sometimes that can make such a difference, of just, if you're just heard and listened to, I would love to see, I don't know, I would just love to see that become more of the norm, especially after hearing so many stories of medical gaslighting.
Yeah, I think that should be at the core of everything in terms of medical practice, well, in terms of everything in general, but in medical practice, the patient, if you can do nothing else for the patient but make them feel heard, I
Yeah,
think that should be seen as a success. Because
yeah,
sometimes there isn't an answer and sometimes there's not, we haven't got the right test yet, or you do need to go see someone else and you need to see the right consultant. But yeah, just having that opportunity to make sure that when you're going in, you feel heard.
yeah. And you know what? I have so much respect for people who can still, because this was not how I was. And I honestly really regret that I didn't feel safe enough to say, you know what, I actually really am scared to have this operation, or I really am scared that I'm being discharged under palliative care and I want somebody to explain what this means to me. Because I think the feelings of anger and resentment and all of it kind of stemmed from fear. But I wish that I had felt safe enough to voice that fear in the first place. So it didn't evolve into more kind of destructive feelings that really destroyed my mental health in the end.
Yeah, and that's a very important point that you touched on there because I was reflecting when you said about feeling safe enough to. I'm not sure that I've ever felt safe in a medical environment, which is not good, but I'm sure that is a shared experience as well. And having that safety and that you know that you're going to be heard is just, it's so important. And being able to say this is scary because it is scary. It is a terrifying thing to have to go through. With my own medical things, I go through a lot of times where I'm really scared. And I've had times where I felt like I could speak up and say, oh, actually, I'm feeling really scared about this. And then times when I didn't feel like I could. And being able to voice it and say, okay, I have this heart condition. This is going to significantly affect my life. I'm actually really scared about what that's going to mean. When I'm in positions where I can do that with my cardiologist, it helps me process it and helps me learn to live with it because it's not something I have to keep to myself. It's not like I'm carrying it on my own. So it does make a massive difference having that.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely feel that with, again, kind of the specialist hospital who saw me back then and were really the first kind of medical people to treat me with respect and kindness. And I think maybe even just empathy. And you know what? I think even now I can tell that they see me as more than just like a name on a list that they just have to get through to tick a box. They every time they ask me about how my studying's going, if I feel okay in myself, and they even ask me if I'm doing okay, like emotionally, and have offered, at one point I was having very intensive counselling through them, and it was never used against me. And you know what? I think that in terms of like my recovery, I think that intensive counselling was up there with TPN and my surgery in terms of importance for me. And I think it's made me realise that even if it's scary, I think it's so important to talk about how we feel living with chronic illness, because our emotional health is just as important as our physical health too.
I completely agree. Being able to have those conversations like we are now, I think it's massively empowering. And me, when I was at my worst points of my health, I listened to other people's experiences, and that made me feel like I wasn't alone. Even if there wasn't someone in the room who understood me, I could hear someone else who was experiencing something similar, and I knew that I wasn't alone in that.
Yes, yeah, because it's a very isolating experience living with any kind of chronic illness, whether it's, something like ME, which obviously millions of people across the UK have, or something much more rare. It can feel so lonely, especially like, again, I know I said that I lost a lot when I first became unwell. Obviously, I had to drop out of school, and school as well was my main social kind of, like, it was my main social group. I had a group of friends. We would spend weekends together. We were in lessons together. And as soon as I left, that kind of dropped off. And obviously, I can look back and recognize that we were all very young at that time. I was young, they were young. And, now I get messages from them and they'll say, I'm really sorry that I wasn't there for you more. I just didn't know how to handle it and stuff. And, now I can understand that as an adult. But at the time, even if that was said to me, I was like, well, what do you mean? Like, I don't know how to handle it either. Like, just say, hi, how are you? But connecting with other people who have, whether it's like your own, whether it's somebody who has the same conditions as you, or somebody who just like has a chronic illness, because I think there's so much, even like dependent of the diagnosis label, that is shared, medical gaslighting, losing people who were important in your life who just didn't know how to handle it and dropped off, all of these things hurt so much. They're so painful, and nobody else is going to understand that apart from people with chronic health conditions or who are living with long-term illnesses. Of even something like dating, navigating like the dating world with, I often confide in my chronic illness friends of like, I just don't know how to bring it up, like I'm like, how do I up? And it's not something you can avoid really, because the first date they'll say, where did you go to uni? Oh, I didn't go to uni. Why didn't you go to uni? And I have to, like, I'm still navigating that, but it makes it, all of those experiences, it makes it a little less lonely to surround yourself with people who have those shared experiences.
Yeah, and people you can go to for advice on like things like this and be able to say, well, what do I do? Or do you have you got an experience with this? It just makes it a lot easier because there is no perfect guidebook that comes alongside living with chronic illness. You don't get your diagnosis and your manual, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It would be helpful.
It would be so helpful if you were just given a guidebook of how to cope with living with chronic illness. But I guess it's kind of like the point of having platforms like this podcast or my blog, A Note of Hope, as well. It's like that was the main kind of goal, and I can imagine it must be for you too, Elizabeth, of just trying to make people feel less alone in it, and maybe even less alone yourself, of being able to talk and connect with people. Yeah, I find it really powerful that so many amazing voices are able to emerge through social media in the chronic illness community.
Yeah, and for me, that's always been the biggest way I've learned. Like when I say about the guidebook there, I think it definitely, like, if I was to say where have I learned the most from, it is from other people. And essentially we have, as a community, have created our own guidebook, have created our own kind of path and journeys, and through sharing those, help other people find their own. And I do think that's amazing. And I think your project is also amazing. And I would love to hear a bit more about that. And you've just briefly touched on it there, but like how you ended up starting that. Was there like a moment where you're like, this is what I'm going to do?
Yes. So I run a blog or a platform called A Note of Hope, which is just a website dedicated to sharing stories from the chronic illness community. So kind of like what you do, Elizabeth, but I have always been a very passionate writer. And, that is something that what I really want to do when I go to university and stuff is journalism. So for me, it was just a way of exercising my skills, but also of combining my love of, raising awareness for the chronic illness community with my love for writing. So that was where the idea kind of first came from. I must admit that recovery coming out of COVID, I was kind of, suddenly my whole world was opened up in a way it had never been before, or not since I was 16 and became unwell. Suddenly I had all of this free time and people were asking me, so what are you going to do with your life? Which was a terrifying question, because for so long I had been told, this is it. There's nothing more we can do. You're going to have to accept that this is your life. Suddenly my life was open again. And so I panicked massively, because suddenly I wasn't 16 anymore. I was 23. And suddenly the amount of time I had lost felt very, very real all of a sudden. And I was surrounded by people who had full-time jobs, or who had just come out of university and were now getting full-time jobs. And obviously I had no experience. I think I was very aware of that, of how competitive the job market is anyway, when you come also with limitations of just how much more competitive that job market gets. And so I approached the Prince's Trust, as it was known at the time. I think it's called the King's Trust now, and joined their business startup enterprise program. And I did the mini course, which was across 3 days, and then I was assigned a mentor. And I really felt like my confidence was on the floor at that time, because I hadn't had to do anything for a long time apart from be a patient and just get through day by day. And so when I spoke to my mentor one-on-one, I was like, I don't want to waste your time. Like, I have no ideas. I don't know what I want to do. So, take me off the program. And fair play to him, because he was like, no, we have an hour. Let's take like an hour and get to know each other. And you can tell me what you love to do, and we can think about it in that way. And I really appreciated just having that space, rather than being asked, what do you want to do? What are you going to do next and stuff, in terms of a career or, a university and whatever. He was saying, what does Ellie like to do in her? What are your passions, And you know what? I struggled at first. I was like, I don't know. And then I began explaining how writing had meant so much to me throughout the whole of my life, from crafting tiny little books when I was like 3 or 4 or 5 about me and Hannah Montana, or me owning a pony. They're all stacked up in my cupboard somewhere, to writing a journal throughout my worst times, because that was a place where I could really just say however I felt. I could just write it down and know that no one was going to see it, and it was very cathartic for me. And so I began thinking, well, what if I always wanted to be a journalist. That was when I was in sixth form even. That was what I was aiming to go to university for back then. But I think because when I became unwell, I kind of wrote that all off as like, oh, well, I can't do that anymore. That it didn't even enter my mind that perhaps was something I could do again, even in a different capacity. And he was like, well, why don't you start writing people's stories, and writing your own story and sharing it with people. And so that was where A Note of Hope was born from. Obviously, it didn't turn into a business, but I am so passionate about it. And I think there's so much value in it being kind of, sometimes people describe it as a charity. It's not a charity, it's not, but it's definitely a voluntary, like I do it in my spare time, basically now that I'm a student full time. And I find it's my baby. I love it so much. It fulfills that kind of wish I had of wanting to share from my mistakes. I don't know if that's right. Again, there's no guidebook. There's no way to do it right. But I do have so many regrets of, even though some people left when I first became unwell, I also isolated myself massively and didn't want to talk to people. And that made me so incredibly lonely and depressed. And so I don't want other people to feel like that. I want them to feel that even if they don't feel understood or accepted in their own circle, there is a community online. It doesn't have to be A Note of Hope. It can be your podcast, or other amazing projects and initiatives, that I just thought, if I could make a difference to one person, that's enough for me. And so now A Note of Hope, I kind of again, very similar to this, I will meet people either in person, through Zoom, or on a video call, or people can even submit their own story in writing. I think what sets A Note of Hope apart from other projects, because obviously I know it's not a unique concept, and that people can share they share their stories in other platforms and stuff, and most charities even will have a section where people can share their stories. I think what I wanted to set A Note of Hope apart is that I would write your story from my perspective. and focus and highlight things that maybe you might overlook, So like, I think sometimes, I guess that has been really like, it's been like such a formative thing for me in terms of developing my writing skills, is that, reading something or talking to someone and picking things out that they say. And, when I send it to them, they say, oh my God, you just picked out everything that like I wanted to say, and I didn't know how to express it. And I always like to make, like, I don't know, I like to highlight their strength, or without being too cliche, inspirational, or their resilience. And I just really want to make it a platform that makes people feel good and feels heard and appreciated. And I always say that our main kind of goal for that project, or for A Note of Hope, is sharing your pain, but also the things that have brought you joy and hope, to hopefully spread that and give other people hope, and I really like the fact that even though I give a voice to people's pain, I think we need more, not, I guess, positivity. I know that is sometimes a difficult subject in the realm of chronic illness, because nobody wants to be told, just be happy. And but I think just like, if you recognize the small joys in life, it can be so powerful. Having a lovely cup of tea in the morning with 2 sugars instead of 1, or watching your favorite TV program, or reading a really good book, or having a chat like we are right now. It's the little things in life that sometimes on our hardest days keep us going. And I wanted that to be the main message of A Note of Hope, not to force ourselves to be positive, or to make out that everybody can recover like I have. I'm very aware that is a very rare situation, and that I'm extremely lucky and fortunate. Obviously, it took hard work to get to where I am today, but there is an element of, I just had the right surgery and it was luck in some sense. Sometimes it can be misunderstood, A Note of Hope, in terms of sometimes people, I think of it in that way, of that I'm pushing this agenda of, if we focus only on the positives. But I think most people get that it's why I give a voice for people to share their stories and their biggest challenges, as well as the things that have brought them hope and joy, and things that brought them through the hardest times.
Yeah, and I think that really does come across. And when I first saw it, that's what I thought of, those moments of hope and joy amongst even the hardest times, like situations I've been in my health where I thought, I can't really see a positive in this at all. I don't know what, my future's going to be like. But then there's a moment, and you're there in the sun setting as you're driving home from hospital, and it looks beautiful, and you have that little spark of hope. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that I'm thinking I'm going to ever get any better at all. But that moment, that's sunset, that's hope for me. And that's enough. And I think that really comes across in the way that you have put together A Note of Hope. And I think it's very powerful to try and hold on to those little joys and hopes in life, even if they might look different to how they did before.
Oh, that means so much to me, because obviously I hope that people, again, like hope just being a word that's used all the time, but I hope that that's what people take away from the project. But obviously, you put stuff out, it's open to interpretation. But I must admit, it makes my heart burst when I get lovely messages, or people, saying that they love the project and want to be involved. And yeah, so it's really lovely to hear that. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you today and hearing all about your experience and your amazing project.
Oh, thank you so much.
A big thank you to Ellie for sharing her experience with us. See the links in the description to learn more about Ellie and A Note of Hope. Be sure to follow to keep up to date with the latest episodes. And as always, thanks for listening.